For this, it is imperative that all nations, organizations, and individuals must work together towards the common goals and shared values by engaging in open dialogue and building trust. May I request all of you to please be seated. We're moving into the next session. Please be seated, ladies and gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen, on to our session now on aligning global priorities. I'd like to request the President of the Confederation of Indian Industry, Mr. R. Dinesh, to please come up and to escort our next speaker, the G20 India Sherpa, Mr. Amitabh Kant, onto stage. May I request Mr. Dinesh to please welcome our speaker and also introduce the session.
Good morning, everyone. And Amitabh, thank you for making it here, and thank you for giving us this time today.
All to welcome Mr. Kant. Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. It's over to you, Mr. Dinesh.
So let me start again. So thank you, Amitabh, for being here with us. I don't think you need significant introduction, but I think you have been somebody who has seen, developed, and built innovation for India. And today, obviously, you're piloting us through this journey as we get into the G20 as the G20 Sherpa. So I thought it would be very interesting to hear from you how you have been approaching this, and then I will start with a few questions and then throw it open to the floor so that we can make it very interactive.
Thanks, Dinesh. Let me first thank Mr. Chandrasekhar for his outstanding leadership during the B20. I think the work done by the B20, and its various task force has been truly spectacular in terms of the intellectual input that has come out. And I can assure Mr. Chandrasekhar that many of the recommendations that have been made by the Business 20 will definitely find a place in the leaders' declaration that will come out later subsequently. Ladies and gentlemen, India is hosting the G20 presidency at a time when the world is facing several challenges. 1/3 of the world is in recession. 75 countries are facing a global debt crisis. You have a crisis of food, fuel, and fertilizer, climate action. The post-COVID era has seen about 200 million people go below the poverty line. 100 million people have lost their jobs. Huge challenges. And the war, the geopolitical crisis in Europe continues for over a year and a half. But every crisis is a huge opportunity. And for India, hosting the G20 is an opportunity to what the Prime Minister has said, to be inclusive, to be decisive, to be action-oriented, and to be very ambitious. So India's been very ambitious in its G20 presidency. Unlike other G20 presidencies, India has taken the G20 presidency to all the states of India. It has hosted it in 60 cities of India, and it has made it a people's presidency. Every single citizen of India has been involved in the G20 presidency in the entire course of 1 year. Secondly, ladies and gentlemen, India's presidency is being held at a time when India has accelerated its pace of growth. India is the 5th largest economy in the world. It will soon, in 2027, be the 3rd largest economy in the world. And it is doing this as a lively, vibrant democracy, with a leader, and it's important to say this because the leadership of G20 is being held by the Prime Minister, who's a democratically elected Prime Minister 2 times over, and whose popular rating still continues to be above over 70%, 75%. And therefore, the leadership of the G20 is very critical. But it's also being held at a time when India has taken vast number of developmental measures. In the last 7 years, we've constructed over 40 million houses, which is like making a house for every single Australian. We've made over 110 million toilets, which is like making a toilet for every single German. We've provided water to 223 million households, which is like providing water to every single citizen of Brazil. And we've made 55,000 kilometers or square kilometers of roads, which is almost 5 times the diameter of the earth. Ladies and gentlemen, India's driven the digital agenda. We do 46% of the real-time fast payment in the world. We do 11x payment of what United States and Europe do. We do 4x of what China does. And from identity to banking to linking the identity and the mobile number to cashless paperless credit to cashless paperless wealth creation by taking stock markets to tier 2, tier 3 cities, and to providing insurance on the go, on mobile in 1 minute. This is a huge disruption which Indian startups have carried out. Vast number, we have over 110,000 startups. We've been able to build the 3rd biggest startup movement, and this is a remarkable feature that all the disruptions are today being carried out by young entrepreneurs who've become great national assets for India. So ladies and gentlemen, India has done, this is the political, the developmental and the ideological strategy, development philosophy behind India, that we believe that despite different political ideologies, different geographical boundaries, we all come from the same cosmos, and we need a human-centric approach, and that is why Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, one earth, one family, one future. And the 3rd key thing is what are the key priorities which India is pushing for? During India's presidency, the key is that we'll drive for strong, sustainable, inclusive, balanced growth. And growth is critical for the world because, as I said, the world is getting into recession. And therefore, after every COVID, every pandemic, the world has seen, historically has seen 6 years of protectionism. It's important for the world to get away from protectionism because free trade has lifted people above the poverty line. Vast segments of the world have gone above poverty line because of free trade. And India's key priority is growth with free trade by breaking protectionism in the world. And that will be one of our key strategies. The second key priority is that the post-COVID era has seen the world decline instead of progressing in sustainable development goals. Only 12 of the 169 sustainable development goals are on track, and therefore accelerating the pace of sustainable development goals, improving learning outcomes, health outcomes, improving nutritional standards is important. And the third key priority is climate action and climate finance, because the earth may survive, but we'll all go extinct. And therefore, very concentrated action for climate action, which requires climate finance, is critical for the world. And this would require energy transition. This will require just and inclusive, huge amount of energy transition. India has done its bit by doing about 185 gigawatts of renewable energy. We are the only G20 country to have met its NDC target 9 years ahead of schedule, and the only G20 country to have been on top of the Clean Climate Index. So ladies and gentlemen, both SDG and climate require long-term resources, as was said by the private sector. It requires over about 5 trillion of resources. Ladies and gentlemen, the world is not short of resources. 5 trillions only, but the world has close to about 350 trillion of resources today. The investment companies, the asset companies, the pension funds, the insurance funds themselves alone have 150 trillion worth of resources. And therefore, but the challenge is that the risk of developing countries is very different from the risk of developed parts of the world. But all the growth is now going to come from Global South. The IMF predictions are that this year, 80% of the global growth is going to come from Global South, because the demographics are young, there's low dependency burdens. And in the next 2 decades, 2/3 of the global growth is going to come from Global South. If Global South is going to drive the global economy, because the western part of the world will be aging, the population in India and other emerging markets will keep getting younger, you need resources to flow in here. And that would require multilateral financial institutions to be restructured and redesigned. They were made in the post-World War II period, the post-Bretton Woods period, when there was no challenge of SDG, when there was no climate change crisis. And therefore, they need to be restructured to confront the climate change and bring in new instruments like blended finance, first loss guarantees, and credit enhancement to allow private capital to flow into the Global South. And this, to our mind, is the most critical issue. The other key priority for India is technological transformation and digital public infrastructure. The digital public infrastructure model of India is unique. It's open source. It's open APIs, it's interoperable, and has allowed every Indian to do fast payments. It's enabled us to provide access to education, to create a whole range of new infrastructure like DigiLocker, etc., which has, the data is owned by the citizens, and therefore it's a very different model from what the other parts of the world have created. The challenge is, if you look around the world, 4 billion people of the world do not have a digital identity. 3 billion people do not have a bank account. 133 countries in the world do not have fast payments. So if you want to do inclusion, which is the top priority of Business 20, Mr. Chandrasekhar said #1 priority is inclusion. And if we want to do inclusion, then digital identity, bank accounts, fast payments are a must. And therefore, technological transformation is really the key to the world. And that is what we will drive it during India's presidency. The last key priority for India is what the Prime Minister has focused on, women-led development. Because India believes that 50% of the population of the world are women. It's important, if the world has to grow, you need equity, you need inclusiveness, you need basically bridging the gender digital divide, you need better learning outcomes, health outcomes, and breaking the vicious cycle of malnutrition for women, so that this 50% of the race, or the human race, will accelerate the pace of change. And they have to be put into leadership positions. So ladies and gentlemen, these are the key priorities for India. A different philosophy of one earth, one family, one future, priorities which will radically transform the world towards a human-centric approach, and making this a people's presidency have been the key aspects of India's G20 presidency. Thank you.
Thank you, Amitabh. Thank you. Really, I think it sets a tone for how the G20 is going to be looking at this. I thought, considering the time, I will directly go ahead and take about 3 questions from the audience, and then you can club them together and answer. So, anyone would like to ask a question to Amitabh? Okay, so I will start with a very quick question. So, I think from all of the approaches, how do you see those coming together under the what I would call as a 360-degree approach to growth and lifestyle, which I think the Honorable Prime Minister has spoken about? And how do you see that impacting not just India, but also the developing countries and across the globe?
So Dinesh, we are having negotiations are going on every day. Actually, they start around 2 o'clock, they go up to 2 o'clock in the night. These are very contested negotiations because every single country is at a different stage of development. There are different national circumstances. Saudi Arabia has different national interests than United States, and Europe has different interests from China and so on. So these are very contested, every word is fought for in these negotiations. But the challenge is to bring in consensus. And one key area where consensus has been brought in to a great extent is on lifestyle for sustainability, because it's not just the governments who will bring change to climate action, it's individual behavioral change, what is today called as nudging behavioral change. We keep our lights switched on, we keep our fans switched on, we keep our water taps changed on. So what the Prime Minister said is that it's not the leaders, it's not the governments, bring the change from individual. And therefore, if every single individual contributes to climate action, the world will be a different place. And therefore, we've come out with with principles of lifestyle for sustainability, which have been accepted by every single country. We'll take them forward, and then we'll take them forward to implementation, because the International Energy Authority has said, IEA has said, that mere behavioral change will actually lead to a 30% reduction in greenhouse gas emission. And that's huge.
Thank you. And also I would like to acknowledge the presence of Mr. R.K. Singh, Secretary DPIIT. Thank you for being here with us, sir.
How can G20 help in bringing peace between Ukraine, and I think our Prime Minister can play a very important role, the war in Ukraine?
Okay.
Hello.
Go ahead.
Here.
Please.
Thank you, Mr. Dinesh. Mr. Kant, this is Shukla from Mahindra Group. You made a very pertinent point that there is 150 trillion floating in various institutions, private sector institutions, and all we need is perhaps 5 trillion. You also pointed out there are different risks in global south from the developed countries. What are we thinking about addressing those developed south, the global south, so that this money feels comfortable coming in there? Thank you.
Hello.
Thank you, Amitabh. I really appreciate it. Purnima Vaurya, National US-India Chamber of Commerce, Advisor to Secretary of Commerce for 7.8 million minority businesses of US, $1 trillion economy of US. We have had met in Hyderabad with Ivanka Trump's delegation, and my suggestion to you is President Kagame is the chairman of the African Council, would be a good consideration for what you just said in Africa. Kigali Bank chairman would be a very good asset for the funding that you are talking about. There is a lot of resources, and yes, they are very prominent in Rwanda. My suggestion, a couple of suggestions that I have already said, but I don't want to take up time here, but also wanted to talk about, a World Rocky Day that Prime Minister can create. Our AKHI stands for Raising Awareness and Knowledge Through Humanitarian Initiative. There's an economic development side of this. a flimsy thread of love, but carries very important message of brotherhood and peace. Thank you very much.
Shobna, go ahead. We'll finish.
You know, I've always heard you talk so positively. I mean, if anyone ever has a doubt about India or the world, I think we just have to hear Mr. Kant, and you just tell the narrative so fantastically. But I really want to know, what are your worst nightmares? What is the risk that you think of all these wonderful things that you talk about that are actually happening, but if they don't scale or something goes wrong, what really scares you?
Well, let me first start with Shobna's question, because I think that's the easiest. You know, first of all, I don't have any nightmares. I sleep very well. I try and do a morning exercise. You know, I get inspired from Chandra still doing marathon runs. So that's an inspiration for many of us. So I spend about 1.5 hours on my exercise, and no nightmares at all. The challenge is, actually G20 is it's a tough job, because to be able to convince all the Sherpas that this is what the world needs, and this is where we need to take the world to. And every single country has its own national perspective. You have to align them to a global perspective and take them to say that this is required not for your country, but for the world, for every single citizen of the world. And that's important. And that's a huge job, very tough, challenging job. On the issue of what the lady from there asked about, let me say that India's presidency is one of its high features. Very high features will be that it's really emerged as the voice of the global South. 6 of the fastest growing 12 countries is actually coming from, you know, if you look at the 12 fastest growing countries in the world, 6 of them are actually coming from Africa region. And so throughout our presidency, one thing that we've done, it started with the Prime Minister having a Voice of the Global South Summit, where he met 125 leaders, and his advocating by writing to all the leaders that African Union must have a permanent membership of G20. And this is the first time after decades that Africa, we are spearheading a movement to get African Union a permanent membership of G20. And that would make G20 a very, very inclusive body, because that will give membership virtually to 55 countries of African Union. So it's a remarkable, and this move of the Prime Minister has received overwhelming support from all the leaders of the world. So we are very hopeful that this would really be a really remarkable feature of India's presidency to our mind. And the third question that was asked about $5 trillion being the need and $150 trillion you know, being available. I think the key to that is that you know, multilateral development banks, they do a lot of direct funding based on their balance sheet. They need to go beyond their balance sheet and look at global balance sheets and actually move to indirect lending, so that they are able to utilize the instruments of MEGA, first loss guarantees, credit enhancement to enable 15 times more resources to flow in, to flow into Global South. That is the key to my mind, because if Global South grows, if 2/3 of the growth is going to come from Global South, and if resources are made available and backed by good governance in the Global South, then the world will grow for the next 3 to 4 decades. That is the reality of the world, and it's very important that multilateral financial institutions, the international financial architecture, both the international financial architecture is heavily weighed against the Global South right now. Instead of resources flowing in from the developed world to the developing world, actually resources are flowing out from the developing world to the developed world. This financial structure needs to be realigned. The multilateral development banks need to put greater amount of indirect lending into the Global South. That is really the key. Money is available in plenty with all institutions. Yeah, please. So, one last question, which I think the gentleman, Mr. Goel, asked here about, about providing, ensuring that on the Ukraine war. Let me say that G20 is actually an economic body. It's a body for growth. The political body is the United Nations. But issues of war lead to challenges on food, fuel, and fertilizer, and therefore there's a huge implication in terms of economics. That's what other countries are saying. The war is not our creation. The war is not our creation. Our challenge is to put developmental issues right in the forefront. And that is the challenge. The world's challenge is to handle the developmental issues. On the issues of war, last year in Bali, we fell back on the United Nations resolution, and we are quite hopeful. We are quite hopeful that we'll convince everybody to find an amicable issue to the geopolitical issues. Thank you.
Sorry, we'll finish with that question, yeah.
Thank you. My name is Seema Chaturvedi. Amitabh, I have had the pleasure of meeting you a few times before. What I want to qualify a statement you made. The fastest growing, I say, the fastest growing economy is not a country. It's actually women. And my question is, and that's globally true. So I represent, thank you. And this is not meant to be a political statement. I'm actually a fund manager myself, actively investing at the intersection of gender smart, gender equity, and climate action. Request to the G20 delegates, as somebody who spent 30 years investing in making people rich, my request is let's definitely focus on women-led development is brilliant. Focus on women entrepreneurs, focus on women self-help groups. But one very significantly catalytic movement is supporting the allocators of capital, i.e. fund managers, because there is a very highly studied correlation between female-led fund managers and female-backed or female-led enterprises. So if we can encourage multilateral banks, development banks, to focus on this category of supporting women fund managers, that can be a very significant game changer in bringing forth that whole population, which is usually 50% of any country.
So India's G20 presidency is fully aligned with your perspective. Thank you. Fully aligned.
Thank you, Amitabh. I think you're giving us a lot of hope for the G20 now.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kant and Mr. Dinesh. May I request Mr. Dinesh to please present Mr. Kant with a small token of appreciation. Thank you, sir, that you've spared time to be here with us. More power to you and to the G20. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen, we move on to the next plenary session, which is AI for Business and Societies, Opportunities and Regulations. May I request you all to please remain seated. Those of you who do not have a seat in this hall, we have an adjacent hall called Shah Jahan, where we have adequate seating. So please do join us in Shah Jahan.